The wind moaned low across the open plains, sweeping through dry grass like whispered warnings from the ancestors. The sky above was vast and merciless, painted with streaks of ash gray and gold as dusk fell over the land. In this expanse, where even the buffalo kept wary eyes and few dared travel alone, a giant moved silently. They called him Tacho, though most whispered his name like a prayer or a curse. Towering above other warriors, with broad shoulders and a chest like the trunk of an old tree, he seemed carved from the earth itself. His face bore few expressions, stone-set, his dark eyes unreadable. Scars lined his arms, some from war, others from survival. The Comanche respected him. The settlers feared him. But neither truly knew him. He had not always lived in solitude. Once, long ago, there had been a village, a family, a reason to laugh. But time and cruelty had stripped him of those things: raiders, sickness, betrayal. Each loss took something from him until the warmth in his heart dulled and finally vanished. He walked away from his people, from memory, into the wild. Over time, tailies grew around him. Mothers warned children not to wander too far lest the giant take them. Travelers claimed to see him atop hills, silhouetted against the moon, watching but never approaching. Some said he was more beast than man now, but in truth, Tacho was simply surviving. He lived in a hidden shelter tucked between cliffs in the north, where the land dipped and the winds howled. It was neither home nor prison merely. A place to be. He hunted when he needed, fished when he could. His days were filled with repetition and silence, his nights with the groaning of wind and the echoes of old memories. The plains gave him solitude, and solitude gave him peace. Or at least, it didn't demand anything from him. And after all, he had lost. That was enough. Until the storm. It had rolled in quickly, as the worst always did: angry clouds, cold rain, wind like knives. Even the coyotes had gone quiet. Tacho had been returning from a long-range hunt, a deer over his shoulders, when the scent hit him. Blood. Faint but unmistakable. He froze, instincts sharpening. It was not the blood of the deer he carried. This was fresh, human, wounded, dying. Something deeper than caution stirred in him, something ancient, something unspoken. He followed the scent without fully understanding why. He found her near the ravine's edge, half buried in wet leaves and earth, her dress torn, one shoe missing. Pale, nearly blue with cold. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, matted with blood. For a moment, he thought she was dead until her chest twitched with a shuddering breath. She was small, fragile-looking, a settler woman, no older than mid-20s, maybe younger. He could not place her origin. Tacho crouched beside her, studying. The bruises, the cracked lips, the gash on her side. She had been running from something. Or someone. Logic told him to walk away. She was not his problem. If anything, helping her could mean danger. A trap, retribution. Her people were not his, and they would never welcome him. He had no reason to get involved. And yet. Her hand twitched toward him as if sensing his presence. It was not a cry for help, but a flicker of life, of instinct. Something in that broken gesture pierced the wall around his heart. It wasn't pity he felt, it was recognition. He too had once been broken, left to die. And someone, long ago, had chosen not to leave him behind. With a grunt, he set down the deer, wrapped her in his heavy buffalo hide cloak, and lifted her easily into his arms. The woman weighed less than a bundle of firewood. Her breath came in. Faint gasps. She did not wake. That made things easier. He walked through the rain without looking back, his face grim, his steps steady. By the time they reached the shelter, darkness had fully descended. Tacho laid her near the fire pit, built ablaze, and set to work. He cleaned her wounds with clean water from the stream, wrapped them in spare cloth. He worked silently, methodically, as though patching a wound in himself. She did not stir, but her breathing grew more regular, the color faintly returning to her cheeks. Tacho watched her in the flickering firelight. Her face was peaceful, despite the bruises, vulnerable, alive. He sat back against the stone wall, arms crossed over his chest, and stared into the flames. The wind howled outside. Inside there was only warmth. For the first time in years, Tacho wasn't alone, and though he wouldn't admit it, not yet, something inside him had already begun to change. Rain fell in relentless sheets. The storm, showing no sign of mercy. Thunder cracked like gunfire across the sky, and wind slammed against the stone walls of Tacho's shelter, but inside, the fire crackled steadily. The warmth didn't touch him, not yet, but it surrounded the frail form lying only a few feet from him. The woman was still unconscious, her skin damp, hair tangled. He had wrapped her in layers of hide and blankets. Her clothes, soaked through and torn, hung near the fire, steaming. Tacho had done what he could, bound the gash on her ribs with cloth torn from one of his old shirts, rubbed heat into her hands and feet, and kept her head propped carefully with a folded pelt. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't even stirred. Sat cross-legged, elbows resting on his knees, staring at her as though she were some puzzle sent by the spirits. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had driven her to collapse in the wilderness, alone and bleeding? Tacho wasn't the type to ask questions, certainly not of strangers. But this woman had already broken every rule he lived by. He should have walked away. He wanted to forget she existed, to return to the rhythm of silence. But some part of him, long buried beneath years of loss and numbness, had rebelled at the sight of her broken in the dirt. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Her lips parted, barely a whisper escaping. He leaned closer. She mumbled again, a dry, weak sound. He poured a small measure of water into a gourd and lifted her gently, supporting her head as he held it to her lips. She drank, barely, and then fell still again. But he saw it somewhere beneath the surface. She was fighting to live. By the second day, the storm had passed. The wind died to a whisper, and the sky opened wide again. But inside the shelter, the atmosphere remained thick with tension. Tacho kept close watch, stepping outside only to gather fresh water and tend the firewood. His movements were swift, practiced. Still, he lingered less in the cold now. He felt tethered, as if something small and fragile was holding him there. And then, on the morning of the third day, she woke. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden sitting up, no gasp. Just a soft rustling of hides and the creak of her dry throat. Tacho turned quickly. She lay with her eyes open, blinking into the dim light of the shelter, confused, frightened. Her gaze found him, and he saw her stiffen. He was used to that. Tacho was an imposing figure, more shadow than man in most people's minds. Her reaction didn't offend him. She tried to sit up but winced and clutched her side. Tacho held up a hand, palm out, signaling her to stay still. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse. "Don't move." Her lips trembled. She searched for words but found none. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added after a long pause. That, more than anything, seemed to confuse her. She studied him, his long hair, bare-toothed necklace around his throat, the hardened muscles, the expressionless face. But there was something in his eyes that made her pause. Something tired, but not cruel. "Where am I?" Her voice was faint, cracked. He poured more water and handed it to her. She drank slowly, gratefully. "You're safe," he said. "Shelter. You were bleeding, cold." She furrowed her brow. I don't remember." Tacho didn't push. He had seen what trauma could do. Memories didn't always return kindly. "Who are you?" she asked, voice rasping. He paused. Then, Tacho. She repeated it under her breath as if trying it on. Her tongue. Tacho? He nodded once. And you? A beat. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her brows pulled together. I don't know. She looked down, visibly shaking. Panic flickered in her face as the weight of that reality sank in. Number. Name. No identity. No memory of what had happened. Tacho could have walked away, left her to process it alone, but something anchored him in place. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was the first trace of human connection he'd felt in years. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the quiet recognition in her eyes of pain, of loss, of being completely and utterly untethered. You're not alone, he sighed, the words foreign on his tongue. Her gaze lifted. She stared at him for a long moment. And then she nodded slowly, warily, but it was something. He stood and added another log to the fire. For now, they would not speak of the past. Not hers, not his. They would simply survive together. And though neither of them could see it yet, something had begun to thaw, not just the storm outside, but the one inside them both. Tacho never intended to keep her. He told himself that a dozen times each day. She was not his responsibility. She was a stranger, one of them, a settler, a woman from a world that would see him hanged before thanking him. He had saved her life, yes. He had pulled her from death's edge, nursed her body, and kept the fire going so she wouldn't freeze. That was enough. And yet she was still here. Her wounds were healing slowly. The deep gash on her ribs no longer seeped blood, and the bruises along her jaw had faded from violent purple to pale yellow. She still moved with effort and winced when she twisted the wrong way. But she was stronger, eating, drinking, watching him more and more. That unsettled him. He was not used to being watched, especially not with curiosity. Most people looked at him and saw only what they wanted, a savage, a myth, a threat. She, however, watched him the way one studies an unfamiliar creature, wary but not afraid. Sometimes he caught her stealing glances at his hands as he worked, with bone and sinew to mend traps, or at the rough scars across his chest as he stripped bark for fire starting. She never asked questions aloud, but her silence was loud enough. She was thinking, and thinking led to remembering. That, more than anything, made him wary. The moment she remembered who she was or where she came from, she'd leave. Or worse, she'd run, and if she ran, others would come. And if others came, blood would follow. He should have taken her to the edge of the forest days ago. Should have left her near a wagon trail or a settler's path with a few supplies and let fate do the rest. He told himself that every time he stepped outside the shelter and looked toward the horizon, but his feet never moved that way. One morning, Tacho returned from hunting a few rabbits. He expected to find her sleeping, but instead she was upright, sitting against the wall with her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes staring at the fire. The color had returned to her face, and her voice, when she spoke, surprised him. I remembered something. Tacho froze in the entryway. He didn't ask what part of him didn't want to know. My name, she continued. I think it's Clara. The name felt strange in the air, soft and clean, like something that hadn't been touched by the dirt and blood of this land. He grunted, moved to the fire, and began cleaning the rabbits in silence. Clara. He repeated it in his mind, but said nothing. She didn't expect him to. Her eyes lingered on the fire, distant. I don't remember everything, she added, but I know I was running. I was hurt. Someone. Her voice cracked, and she closed her eyes as if pushing the memory back down. Tacho waited, hands working. The blade over rabbit skin. I don't know what he did, but I know I was afraid. Afraid enough to run into the wilderness with nothing. She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked. And you found me. He didn't respond. Not at first. Finally, he said, you should have died. I know. But you didn't, she smiled faintly. Thanks to you. He shook his head. No thanks. I don't need it. Then why did you save me? She asked gently. Tacho didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to know. Because the truth was harder to carry than a wounded woman in the rain. The truth was this. Her brokenness had reminded him of his own. He could not abandon her because he recognized the look in her eyes the moment they opened, the disorientation, the fear, the hollowness of having no place to return to. She was like him. And now she was here, still breathing, still watching him. He stood abruptly and tossed the cleaned rabbit meat into the cookpot, his voice rougher than before. You get stronger. When you can walk, I'll take you south. Near the settlements. Leave you there. Clara flinched at his tone, but didn't look away. I understand, she said softly, but something in her voice told him she didn't want to, and something in his gut told him he didn't either. That night, after she had fallen asleep, Tacho sat near the fire, sharpening his knife. The flames danced across the stone walls. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. He listened, but his thoughts were not on the animals or the knife. They were on her. The stranger with a name now. The woman who had asked why he saved her, and the truth he refused to say aloud, because he had felt cold for so long. And now, with her there, something in the shelter felt just a little warmer. The mornings came earlier now. The storm had passed, and the days were growing warmer. Small things changed in the shelter, more light through the cracks in the stone, birdsong returning to the trees beyond the cliff, and the scent of spring carried in on the wind. But the most profound change wasn't in the land. It was in the way Clara moved and the way Tacho watched her. She no longer lay still in the blankets for hours. Her strength was returning. She walked in slow, deliberate steps, often using the wall for balance. Tacho had carved her a cane from a sturdy branch, and she used it gratefully, calling it her third leg with a half-smile. He had grunted in amusement at her stubborn humor, but said little. Still, his silence was softer now. Every day she woke a little more, not just in body, but in spirit. The fog that clung to her memory began to lift in fragments. The more she healed, the more pieces of her past returned, and the more they did, the more shadows crept in behind them. It started with dreams. The kind she woke from gasping, sweat beading on her brow. She never told him what she saw, but Tacho could guess. Her hand would twitch toward her ribs, her breathing would quicken, and her eyes, when they met his, held something close to panic, but it always passed. Tacho never asked questions. He didn't need to, she told him in time. I remember. A man, she said one afternoon, her voice low as she stared into the fire. Tall, clean-shaven, pale eyes. He always looked angry, even when he smiled. Tacho sat across from her, skinning a rabbit. He said nothing, but his hands paused. I think his name was Samuel, she continued. He owned land, a lot of it, and I think I was supposed to marry him. Her voice trembled with the last word. Supposed to. Tacho didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quiet but firm. You didn't want to? No, she whispered, arms hugging herself. But I didn't have a choice. I think I tried to run before. Once, and he found me. After that, she stopped. Her face paled. Tacho looked at her now, truly looked. And for the first time, there was something in his expression that resembled anger, not at her, but at the man in her memory, the Samuel she still dreamed of, the one whose hand had left bruises on her ribs. I remember his voice, she said, tears threatening. He said if I ever ran again, I wouldn't survive the second time. A long silence fell. You did, Tacho said at last. Clara looked up. You ran, he continued, his voice like distant thunder. You bled, you crawled, and you lived. His words settled on her like a cloak. A strange warmth crept into her chest, relief maybe, or validation. Or something harder to name. You found me, she said. He nodded once. I did. They spent more time together after that, not speaking constantly, but existing in rhythm. Clara began helping with small tasks, sorting roots, grinding herbs, folding hides. She moved more easily, her strength slowly returning. He taught her how to tie snares, how to track squirrels by their broken twigs, how to tell if a plant was poison or food. Her mind soaked it all in like dry earth under spring rain. One afternoon, while collecting firewood together, she asked, "Why do you live out here alone?" Tacho didn't answer right away. When he did, it was simple. Too many ghosts with people. She wanted to press further. She wanted to ask about his scars, about the sadness in his silence, the depth in his eyes that spoke of loss too heavy to name. But she didn't. She understood what it meant to carry pain you weren't ready to speak aloud. Instead, she said softly, "There are ghosts out here too." Tacho looked at her. She met his eyes, unflinching. "Yes," he said. "But they don't talk as loud." That night the air was cool and dry. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Clara sat on a hide blanket, combing through her hair with her fingers, humming something faint and familiar. Tacho sat sharpening an arrowhead, but his eyes wandered to her more than once. "You never ask about where I came from," she said. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Clara gave a soft smile. "That's kind." "No, just not my place." She looked at him, searching his face. "Tacho, when I leave, will you miss me?" He didn't answer. He didn't know the answer. Or maybe he did and was afraid to say it aloud, because the truth was, the silence he once relied on was starting to feel empty again, and the woman who had stumbled into his world half dead and half forgotten was becoming more than just a shadow. She was becoming a part of him. Days passed like whispers on the wind, soft, slow, and strange in their peace. Tacho had lived many seasons in solitude. Seasons where the sky shifted from blue to gold to snow, where his only companions were wind, earth, and fire. But this season was different. Clara was still there, and though she had not asked to stay, she had not asked to leave either. Their days settled into a quiet rhythm. At dawn, he'd rise and stoke the fire. She would sit cross-legged on her blanket, rubbing sleep from her eyes, as he brought water from the stream. They would eat in silence, sometimes sharing a glance, sometimes not. But the silence had changed. It no longer pressed between them like stone. It rested comfortably. Familiar Tacho, once hardened like the rocks around him, found himself softening, not in strength, but in presence. He listened more. He noticed more. The way Clara hummed to herself while grinding herbs with a flat stone. The way she tilted her head at birdsong, as if trying to remember a forgotten melody. The way she walked, now taller, freer, no longer afraid to take up space, and Clara saw things in him too. Small, quiet things, like how he always handed her the first bite of stew, how he slept facing the shelter's entrance, guarding her without saying so. How he watched the stars as if he knew each one by name, but would never speak them aloud. One night, the silence was broken not by words, but by laughter. Clara had been trying to replicate a simple snare Tacho had shown her meant for rabbits. Her fingers tangled the twine beyond recognition, and when the whole contraption collapsed in on itself, she let out a bark of frustration that turned into a sudden, uncontrollable laugh. Tacho looked up, startled. "I swear it worked yesterday," she gasped, wiping tears from her eyes. "I think the trap's plotting against me." He stared at her, eyes narrow, but something flickered behind them. Amusement. "I think the rabbit is smarter than you," he muttered dryly. Clara's eyes widened in mock outrage. Oh, so you do have a sense of humor, he shrugged. Once. In a while, when the moon's in the right place, she grinned. Must be full tonight, then. Tacho shook his head, but the corner of his mouth twitched. That was the first time she made him smile. It was quick barely there, but she saw it. And something warm bloomed in her chest. From that night on, their silences were joined by quiet laughter, shared looks, occasional teasing, moments that might have seemed small to anyone else, but to them they were monumental. By firelight, she began to tell him things. Not the heavy things, not yet, but smaller truths. The name of her childhood dog. A song her mother used to hum. The way the trees smelled back home after it rained. Tacho never spoke of his past. But in return, he showed her his present. He taught her to fletch arrows, to read the sky for signs of coming weather, to recognize distant animal tracks. He let her watch him stitch hides, prepare traps, carve tools. It was as close as he had ever come to letting someone in. One evening, Clara sat beside him beneath the stars. The fire had burned low, and the night was quiet except for the chirr of insects and the distant yip of a coyote. Do you miss them? She asked suddenly. Tacho didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the sky. Yes, he said simply. Clara. Didn't ask who. She didn't need to. There was weight in that one word, whole lifetimes carried inside it. She reached over and gently touched his hand. Her fingers were small against his weathered palm. I miss mine too, she said. He didn't. Pull away. That night, they didn't speak again. But they sat there until the fire turned to embers, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, his arm drawn slightly around her back, not tightly, not possessively. Just enough to be felt. They weren't lovers. Not yet. They weren't family. Not really. They weren't friends in the way people in towns might define it, but they were two souls damaged, displaced, who had found something close to shelter in each other. Tacho had once believed silence was his safest home. But now, with Clara beside him, he realized it could also be shared space. Not a wall, but a bridge. And as she fell asleep with her hand still in his, he closed his eyes for the first time in years, feeling warm. The first time Tacho called her Tiva, he didn't mean to say it aloud. It was early morning, the kind where mist still clings to the ground and the fire's warmth is slow to rise. Clara, still stiff from sleep, had stumbled on the uneven ground outside the shelter, nearly dropping the pot of water she'd carried back from the stream. She caught herself with a soft curse and let out a breathless laugh. Tacho had been carving a handle for a new knife. His eyes followed her, not sharply, not possessively, but attentively. He was always watching her now, in the way a man watches the sun shift across the sky, not to control it, but to understand how it shapes everything else. And then, almost under his breath, he said, Tiva. She turned, brushing hair from her face. What? He looked up, caught off guard. His hands paused on the blade. I said, Tiva. She squinted, confused. Is that a word? He hesitated, then nodded. In my language, it means to dance, or the dance itself. She blinked. You named me? Tacho's gaze didn't waver. You didn't have one when I found you. Clara came later. But before that, you were just a ghost. Clara turned the word over in her mind. Tiva. It sounded like movement, like wind in the trees. She liked the way it sat in the back of her throat. Not soft, not sharp alive. Why dance? She asked. Finally, I can barely walk straight. His eyes flicked downward, just briefly, and then returned to hers. Because you changed everything, he said simply. Like a fire after winter. She didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever named her, not with meaning. Not with reverence. From that morning on, he used the name more often than Clara. Tiva, pass me that pelt. Tiva, this bark's good for fever. Tiva, careful with the firewood. And each time he said it, something inside her steadied. She no longer flinched at footsteps or jerked awake at night. Her dreams still came, but less often. And when they did, she had a voice now, a name, a place. She wasn't just a woman who'd run. She wasn't just the frightened shadow he'd found in the mud. She was Tiva. The shelter became more than stone and hide. It became home. Tacho hung charms above the entrance, small carved bones bound with sinew and feather. He told her they were not for luck, but for memory. So the dead know we still live, she added to them. A small cloth flower she sewed from scrap. A ring she'd found buried in her old coat pocket, maybe from her old life, maybe not. Neither of them needed to know. At night, he would sometimes hum low melodies in his native tongue. Old songs from long before the wars, from before he'd chosen exile. He never sang them in full. Just fragments, half-remembered tunes that curled through the air like smoke. She never asked for their meanings. She just listened, and one night, by the fire, she began to hum her own tune and return something faint, something soft. It wasn't a song she remembered, but one she felt. And when she hummed, he looked at her not with surprise, but with the quiet awe of someone witnessing the return of spring after a long, brutal winter. But even as something grew between them, slow and strange and unspoken, there was always that undercurrent. The name Clara, the man Samuel. The world beyond the trees. She couldn't ignore it forever. You believe names can bind people? She asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands busy with dried herbs, his sharpening a spearhead. He didn't look up. Names are power. They shape the way we carry ourselves. She nodded slowly. Then I want to be Tiva. At that, he paused. Clara. He began, but she cut him off gently. She ran. She was afraid. She bled and barely survived. She looked up at him, her eyes clearer than they had been since the day he'd found her. But Tiva. She fought. She healed. She's still here. He met her gaze. And something passed between them, then recognition. Not of a woman lost, but a woman becoming. He nodded once. Tiva, he said again, and it sounded, finally, like a promise. That night, she lay close to the fire, eyes open, breath slow. Tacho sat nearby, silent, still, his silhouette outlined by the glow of flame. She spoke into the quiet. Did you give yourself your name? No, he replied after a moment. It was given to me when I was young, before the killing. Before I left. Does it mean something? He hesitated. Then, it means mountain lion. For the way I fought. For how I moved. Silent, deadly. Tiva smiled faintly. Fitting. No, he said. Not anymore. She turned her head toward him. And what would you call yourself now? He didn't answer, but she saw the answer in his eyes. He didn't know yet. But maybe, just maybe, she would help him find it. Spring came slowly, unfurling like cautious fingers across the plains. Snowmelt trickled into creeks, wildflowers bloomed along the edges of rocky slopes, and birds returned to nest in the tall pines above Tacho's shelter. The days stretched. Longer, the light warmer. And with it, so did Tiva. She laughed more easily now, walked with her back straight, and her eyes, once dulled by fear, gleamed with quiet strength. She moved through Tacho's world as though it had always been hers. She wore his old clothes, stitched tighter around her waist with scrap leather. She tended the fire without instruction, cleaned fish with a practiced hand, and teased him when he pretended not to notice. But beneath it all, a quiet tension simmered. They both felt it. The peace they had found was borrowed, and they both knew it couldn't last. Tiva was foraging not far from the shelter when it began. The sound of hoofbeats. She froze, crouched behind a thicket, heart pounding. Hoofbeats meant horses. Horses meant men. Men meant him or those like him. The sound came from the west, carried faintly on the wind. Too distant to see yet. Too close to ignore. She ran back to the shelter, breath ragged, and found Tacho sitting, cross-legged, working a new arrowhead. He looked up at her immediately. "They're coming," she gasped. "Riders, I heard them." He stood instantly. No hesitation. He was already moving, already gathering weapons, the bow, the long knife. A handful of arrows. His face darkened. "How many?" he asked. "3, maybe 4. "I couldn't see," he nodded. "We'll go higher. I have a place." The hiding place was a rocky ledge half a mile north, concealed behind thick brush and twisted pine. Tacho had found it seasons ago, a natural alcove high on the cliff wall, barely visible from below. From there, they could see in every direction without being seen. They settled in, silent and tensed out, and then they waited. The riders appeared near dusk. 4 of them, white men. One in a dark coat, riding a black horse. He moved like he was used to being obeyed. Tiva's breath caught in her throat. Samuel. Even from a distance, she knew it was him. He hadn't changed. Pale eyes, cold posture. The same smirk carved onto his face like it had been painted there. As if nothing had ever touched him. As if she were just another broken object to be reclaimed. The other men spread out, clearly searching. She came. "Through here," one said. "She's not far," Samuel replied, his voice sharp even through the wind. "We'll find her." "And when we do?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Tacho watched them with a stillness that chilled the air. He didn't speak. But Tiva saw something in his face that made her skin prickle. Rage. Not loud. Not wild. Not reckless. Cold. Deep. Focused. Kind of rage that had survived loss, war, exile. They didn't move that night. The men made camp below, unaware of the eyes above them. Tacho didn't sleep. He sat upright beside her, bow at his side, gaze fixed on the shadows dancing in the firelight below. Tiva leaned against the wall of the alcove, arms around her knees, trying to stay calm. But her heart was a hammer. Fear pressed in on her like it had in the beginning, raw, suffocating, irrational. She turned toward Tacho. "He'll kill me if he finds me." Tacho didn't look at her. "He won't. He has money, guns. Those men follow him because he pays them to. They don't care what he's done. I do?" She blinked. He had spoken without pause. "I care," he repeated. "I saw what you looked like when I found you. I saw what he left behind. He's not a man. He's a rot." His words were blunt, fierce, and final. Tiva's voice trembled. "You could walk away. Let them take me. It wouldn't be your problem." Now he did turn to her. "I don't walk away." And for the first time, she believed it. At dawn, the men below broke camp and headed northeast. Tacho watched until they disappeared into the distance. "They'll be back," he said. Tiva swallowed hard. "Then we run?" "No." She stared at him. He stood, stretched his arms, and rolled his shoulders like a man preparing for war. "I ran before," he said, voice low. "Left everything. My people, my name, my fight." He looked at her now really. Looked. "I'm done running." Tiva stood too. Her fear still burned, but beneath it now was something sturdier. Faith. Not just in him, in herself. She nodded. "Then we fight." They returned to the shelter that evening, shadows long behind them. Silence stretching between their few words. There was a calmness in their movements now, a purpose. They knew what was coming, but for the first time since her memories returned, Tiva didn't feel hunted. She felt ready, because Samuel wasn't the only one who had come looking. He had found a woman who no longer belonged to him, and she had found a man who would burn. the world down before giving her back. Tacho had never allowed himself to need anyone. Wanting was weakness. Needing was death. That was what the years had taught him, the years of fighting, losing, wandering. He had buried too many dreams beneath the dust of the open plains, lost too many people to trust the future. But Tiva was different. He couldn't say when it happened. Maybe it was when she started humming again, or when she patched the tear in his cloak without being asked. Maybe it was the way she'd leaned her head against his shoulder during those cold nights in the rock alcove. Or the way she said his name now, not like a man to be feared, but a man she believed in. He found himself watching her more often. Not in the way of a hunter tracking a thing that might flee, but like a man who had lived half his life blind and now finally saw. She moved like a flame, soft, flickering, never still, and he, the man of stone, found himself leaning closer to the heat. She had changed everything. Before her, his world was ritual. Hunt, eat, survive, sleep. Now the space between the rituals was filled with her laughter, her questions, the sound of her bare feet across the stone. She had stitched herself into the quiet places of his life without asking permission, and he had let her. That realization alone shook him more than any war ever had. One evening, after the riders had gone and the world had turned still again, they sat by the fire. The light was low, the flames flickering like whispers, and Tiva was mending a hide bag, her fingers nimble with practiced care. Tacho was carving a new arrow shaft, but his hands had stilled. His eyes were on her, studying the curve of her brow, the way her mouth moved ever so slightly as she concentrated. She caught him looking. "What?" she asked, smiling without looking up. He blinked. "You've gotten good at that." "I'm a quick learner," she said, "when I have the right teacher." He grunted, half amused. She set the bag aside and looked at him fully now. "You've changed too, you know." He raised an eyebrow. "How?" "You don't look away when I talk anymore." He hadn't realized he ever had. She shifted closer, folding her legs beneath her. Her eyes were calm, but there was something underneath, something searching. "Tacho, if I asked you to come with me, if we left this place together, would you?" His chest tightened. He hadn't expected the question. The thought of leaving, the shelter, the safety of the stone, the silence, the familiar rhythm filled him with unease. But the thought of her walking away, disappearing beyond the trees, slipping back into a world that had once tried to break her, that was worse. He swallowed. "Where would we go?" "I don't know," she said. "Somewhere that doesn't belong to anyone. Somewhere we could start over. You wouldn't have to hide anymore." "I'm not hiding," he said automatically. She looked at him. Gently, honestly, double Q'd, "Yes, you are." He didn't argue. He couldn't, because deep down she was right. That night, Tacho lay awake long after Tiva had fallen asleep. Her soft breaths came steady in the dark, and her warmth pressed faintly against his side beneath the thick hides. He stared at the fire until it burned to embers, trying to understand the ache inside his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was wanting. For the first time in years, he wanted more than survival. He wanted life, a real life. With her. Not just nights in hiding and days in silence, but laughter in the mornings, touches that meant something. A future that didn't feel like a borrowed dream. He reached out and brushed his fingers against her hair. Tiva stirred, just enough to mumble his name, and in that fragile moment, Tacho realized what had awakened in him was not just love, it was hope. The next morning, he rose before dawn. The sky was a pale gray wash, and mist clung to the grass like memory. He moved silently, gathered his bow and arrows, and walked to the nearby ridge. From there, he could see the path the riders had taken. Faint hoof prints still scarred the earth. He stood there a long time, listening to the wind. He knew they'd return. Men like Samuel didn't stop. They took. They owned. And they believed the world owed them obedience. But Tacho was done giving ground. Tiva had asked if he would leave with her. He would, but not yet. Not until Samuel understood that she was not his to take. She was Tiva now, and Tacho would fight. Not just to protect her, but because he had finally found something worth standing for. No longer just a shadow wandering the wild. He was becoming a man again. The warning came with the birds. Just past noon, the crows scattered from the trees in a black burst, wings flapping frantically toward the sky. Tacho looked up from where he was reinforcing the shelter wall with branches and hide. His instincts sharpened like a blade. Something was coming. Tiva emerged from the trees moments later, carrying fresh-picked herbs. She paused, breath catching as she saw the tension in his stance. "You feel it too," she said. He gave a single nod. They're back. Her hands curled around the bundle of herbs, now forgotten. "What do we do?" He turned to her, voice low, certain. "We stand." "Here." Tiva nodded once. No fear. Not this time. They moved like water after that, fluid, coordinated, practiced. Tacho had trained her in the weeks since the first riders came. She knew where to run, where to hide, how to signal. She knew how to load his second bow and keep. The fire fed, just in case. But today, neither of them would run. They heard the horses first, the sound of hooves crunching earth. 4 of them, same as before. Same leader, Samuel, cold and unrelenting, at the front. He rode with confidence, his pale eyes scanning the rocks and trees as if expecting submission from the land itself. His men followed, rifles ready, eyes twitching. With suspicion, Tacho stood tall outside the shelter, bow in hand, a spear at his back. His dark figure was still, like part of the mountain itself. Samuel spotted him and pulled his horse to a halt. "Well," he called. "There you are." Tacho said nothing. "I've come for what's mine," Samuel continued, gesturing vaguely behind him. "She was taken. I'm here to collect." "She's not yours," Tacho said, his voice like granite. "She never was." Samuel smiled like a man who didn't recognize threats when they weren't spoken in polished English. He dismounted, casually brushing dust from his coat. "You don't know what she is, what she's done." Tacho's grip on the bow didn't tighten. "It didn't need to. I know what was done to her," he said. "And I know you're the one who did it." One of Samuel's men raised his rifle, but Samuel waved him down. "No, let the savage speak. Let's hear what he thinks he knows." Tiva stepped from the shadows then, her presence stopping the men mid-breath. She wore the bone and feather charm Tacho had given her. Her hair was braided, her chin lifted high. "I'm not a secret anymore," she said. "You don't get to erase me." Samuel's smile faltered. "Just slightly. You think he's protecting you?" He scoffed. "He's nothing. A ghost, an exile. I could burn this place to the ground and no one would blink." Tacho took one step forward. Then, "Try." The fight began not with a shot but with a silence. Heartbeat passed. Then another dot, then dash chaos dot. One of the hired men raised his rifle. Tacho loosed his arrow before the weapon was fully lifted. It struck the man in the chest and he crumpled. Without a sound, Tiva ducked behind the rock wall, tossing Tacho the second bow. The second man fired wildly, the bullet cracking against stone. Tacho rolled left, fired again. Another rider down. Samuel ducked, using his horse as cover. He cursed, fumbling for his pistol. The last man tried to flank from the right, but Tiva had already moved. She struck fast from the brush, slashing with a small blade Tacho had given her. The man fell with a grunt, clutching his leg. Only Samuel remained. He stood now, shaking with fury. Dust covered his coat. His gun in hand, he looked at Tiva. "You ungrateful little—" Tacho stepped between them. "No more words," he said. Samuel aimed, But Tacho didn't hesitate. He lunged not as a hunter, but as a warrior. The spear plunged deep into Samuel's shoulder, sending the man reeling backward with a scream. He dropped the gun. Tacho didn't kill him, not yet. He stood over Samuel as the man writhed, gasping through clenched teeth. "I should kill you," Tacho said, "but I want you to remember this. You lost, not because I'm stronger, because she's not yours anymore, because she chose me." By sunset, the fight was over. The wounded men were stripped of weapons and left with water. Samuel, barely conscious, was tied to a horse and sent eastward with a warning scratched onto bark. "If you return, you die." Later, Tiva stood by the stream, rinsing the blood from her hands. Tacho approached, his frame casting a long shadow across the water. "It's done," he said. She looked up at him. "No, it's begun." They stood in silence, the wind carrying the scent of pine and smoke. There was no need to say more. They had chosen each other, and the world had felt it. It had been 3 days since Samuel and his men vanished beyond the ridgeline, leaving nothing behind but hoof prints and broken pride. The world had quieted again, but it was a different quiet, deeper, settled, like the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The birds returned to their perches. The water ran clear. The nights no longer carried the tension of what might come. Tacho and Tiva moved through the days with unspoken rhythm. There were wounds to tend, supplies to rebuild, and walls to reinforce, but beneath it all, something else stirred, something unnamed, something waiting. That evening, they sat together near the fire, as they often did. But this time, there was no need to scan the tree line, no tension in Tacho's jaw, no weapon at his side. The fight was over. Tiva stared into the flames. The flames, the Thojim weapon at his side. The fight was over. Light dancing across her features. She looked older now, but not worn, weathered, tempered. Strong. Tacho watched her as if she were still a question he was learning how to answer. "I don't know what happens next," she said softly. He didn't. "Speak right away? Then you don't have to." She looked over at him, eyes glinting. "I spent so long trying to be invisible," she whispered, "to survive. But when I was with him, even breathing felt dangerous. Every kindness had a cost. Every word had weight." Tacho's hand moved, slowly, resting beside hers in the dirt close, but not touching. "With you," she continued, "I remembered how to breathe again." Silence fell, heavy and full. But it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence before truth. Tacho cleared his throat. "I was a warrior," he began, voice low. "Before, with my people. I fought. I lost. I buried too many names." Tiva turned to him, listening. "I thought I had nothing left to offer the world, that I'd become something used up." He looked down at his scarred hands. "Then I found you." Tiva's eyes softened. "You didn't find me," she said. "You saved me." He shook his head. "I didn't save you. You were already saving yourself. I just happened to be there when you started." She smiled faintly. "But you stayed." He met her gaze. "And this time, he didn't look away. You asked me once if I'd leave with you," he said. "If I'd start over." She nodded slowly. "My answer's yes," he said. "Wherever you go, I'll go." She blinked, stunned by the certainty in his voice. "Are you sure? I've never been more." She reached for his hand then, fingers sliding over his knuckles, rough and warm. "Why?" she whispered. His breath caught, not from fear, but from the truth rising in his chest. Words he had never spoken, not even to the ones he'd lost long ago. "Because I love you." Tiva stilled. The fire popped beside them, but the world narrowed to this quiet moment between two people who had endured and survived, and now stood at the edge of something entirely new. She let the words settle in her bones. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently to his. "I love you too," she said. They didn't kiss right away. It wasn't a fevered thing or desperate. It was steady, patient. Tacho's hand rose to her cheek, rough thumb brushing the edge of her jaw. She leaned into his palm like it was home. When their lips finally met, it was soft and slow, like the world finally aligned and remembered how to turn. There was no fear left in it. Only warmth. Only them. The next morning, they packed lightly. They didn't need much. Just what could be. Carried on their backs and in their hearts. Tacho folded the hides, slung the bow across his chest. Tiva tucked her bone charm into the pocket of her new tunic. They left behind the shelter, but not the memory of it. That place had been their beginning. But beginnings are meant to lead somewhere. They walked east, toward land that hadn't yet been named, toward forests untouched by war, toward freedom. The sun rose ahead of them, and they moved with it step by step, together, not as a warrior and a wounded woman, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two hearts that had found one another in the wild and chosen to keep walking forward. Love had never been spoken in words until now, but it had been there all along, in the tending of wounds and shared silence, in standing side by side against a world that had tried to break them. It had been patient, that had waited. And now it would lead them home.